Welcome to Curious Confessions, where the line between reality and nightmare blurs. Before we unravel tonight's eerie encounter, it would mean a lot to me if you light up that like button and subscribe. Because in this place, curiosity isn't just encouraged, it's essential. Ready to uncover the next confession? Let's begin. So, I've lived in the same town all my life. I've never really been one of those people that wants to see the world. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It's just not my jam. I'm very content with my simple little life in a town of only about 6,000 people. The internet, more specifically Wi-Fi accessibility, hadn't quite reached us until a decade or so ago, and even then most were too poor to afford any kind of setup. Now, we're not backwards, incest-ridden savages or anything. I assume mostly everyone who's still here is pretty much like me, just happy with their small life. Like Mrs. Weller. She's a widow just down the road from where I live, and she's well known for taking in animals that need a second chance. She's got the acreage and know-how, as she's the only one around here that we could call a vet. Actually, she's the reason I'm writing this today. I've recently realized that some of the things that go on around here aren't exactly normal. You live somewhere long enough, and even if the status quo for us wasn't at all similar to how others live, we wouldn't really know. The closest town is separated from us by miles and miles of farmland, about a 45-minute drive. But we've got the dollar store, a small grocery place, gas station, and post office, so why would we ever have a reason to go poking around elsewhere, right? Despite having limited access to the internet at best, we all had a radio. We needed one, really. At least once a week, we'd be informed about some kind of danger, I guess. To us, it was the same kind of warning as the typical, "There's been a crash on blah 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 highway, so plan your route accordingly." Anyway, sorry I got to rambling. I'll get on to the good part, I suppose. A couple nights ago, I had the radio on, just like my mama had always told me to do, when the familiar sound of an incoming PSA roused me from sleep. See, we were taught to always keep some kind of radio going, whether it was in the truck, at the dinner table, or while we slept. The little box on the bedside table started to sing out the alarm we'd all come to be familiar with, not dissimilar to a tornado warning on TV. After about 10 seconds of this, the male announcer began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a PSA for county residents. Mrs. Weller has informed local police that a horse has chewed through the fence and escaped. Please, if you see this animal, stay far away and call 911 to report your sighting. If you begin to hear voices or have thoughts that are not your own, turn away and run. If you begin to feel faint or nauseous while looking at the animal, turn away and run. If the animal makes eye contact with you or begins to walk in your direction, turn away and run. If you cannot see any horse-like animal, but begin to feel a heavy pressure on your chest, enter your vehicle or run home as quickly as possible. If you are inside your home at this moment, remain there until an update has been broadcasted notifying the capture of this animal. Lastly, remember that horses do not speak." Now, I hadn't been too worried about the announcement at the time, since I was already in bed. Even though it's a small town, most of us usually lock our doors at night anyway. I regarded it the same way I do just about every time the PSA tones come across the radio. I made a mental note to keep an ear out for the all okay broadcast and drifted back to sleep, only a little bit concerned with the dull pain growing in my chest. I woke just fine in the morning. When I sat at the kitchen table, a thought started creeping up on me. I'd been so tired when the PSA called out last night, but as the grumble of the coffee maker softly filled the silence, I really took a moment to analyze the words. Well, of course horses don't speak. Everyone knows that, I thought. Even though our town, probably even our county, was indefinitely weird, I'd be confident in saying that all the residents are firmly rooted to reality. We know the announcements are strange, but after generations of tribal knowledge, they kinda just fell into the background. Come to think of it, I really couldn't remember hearing about anyone around here leaving for a different life. I filled my cup, deciding that I'd run by the gas and munch for an egg sandwich so I could sit and talk with the other farmers while I finished breakfast. I got into the truck. The door latch is a little sticky, so I had to slam it loudly a few times before it shut. The sky was still dark, and the air was chilly and humid in the morning hours. I kept my handheld radio on the center console, as the radio in this old truck had stopped chugging years ago when that family of three-headed squirrels made a nest in my wiring harness that I was never able to fully fix. Not the only time I had to deal with those crafty little things either. Last winter, they'd nested up in the attic with insulation and old. "Fuck," I said to the dark truck cab as I slammed on the brakes. The horse. God, I completely forgot. There had been no accompanying broadcast announcing the capture of the horse. A small pang of fear settled in my chest, not quite blooming into full-on panic, yet as I started the 5-point turn it would take to turn around on the 2-lane I'd been on. This control was short-lived, though. Just as my truck became completely perpendicular with the road, my headlights illuminated the last thing I wanted to see, standing in the half-grown soybean field in front of me. It definitely did not look like a horse. The neck was about twice as long as it should have been. Shredded and necrotic flesh clung to its emaciated form. The mane was frizzy and rat-nested, but the worst part was the sheer size of the thing. My best guess for breed was thoroughbred, but the damn thing still stood around 21 hands tall, just at the shoulders. For those who don't know, 21 hands is about 7 feet tall. I'd like to say I kept my cool, that years of living in what's most likely the weirdest place ever has hardened me into a farm boy, tough enough to scoff at unnatural horrors like this one. But I totally didn't. No. I slammed the gas and spun the tires fast enough to complete my U-turn and only skip into the ditch for about a foot or two. For only a moment I had hoped that the horse would just keep being creepy in its creepy little spot on the side of this creepy little road. But of course it didn't. As soon as the truck started moving again, the horse began to run towards me. I felt the truck shake as it leapt into the bed and started pounding its rotting hooves on the top of the cab. My frantic mind only had one idea as I backtracked down the road. After all, Mrs. Weller was only a few miles down from me. I turned on the unpaved road, wheels spinning and sliding on loose gravel as I continued pushing the pedals so hard I was worried it'd break through the rusty floor panels. I could hear crunching glass as the horse nipped on my back windows. Voices screamed in my head all the while. "You should drive into the ditch. Look, there's a telephone pole, take your chance." I did my best to tune it all out, but the exaggerated thudding in my chest was accentuated by an immense pressure. It felt like someone was stacking bricks on my chest. I turned down the next road, and now it was a straight shot to Mrs. Weller's farm. Suddenly, the ear-splitting sounds of tearing metal and shattering glass faded away. In the moment, fear blinded my senses. Muscle memory was the only thing guiding me towards my destination. The lights at the end of her driveway flickered and fought with my headlights. Still hauling ass, I slid the corner into Mrs. Weller's driveway, and the truck lifted a couple inches with the release of weight off of the suspension. Just out of the corner of my eye, I saw the brown flash of an impossibly large, impossibly fast horse running towards the back pasture. I took a breath and steadied myself to back out onto the road when the radio crackled loudly to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a PSA for county residents. Mrs. Weller's horse has been returned to her property, and it is now safe to leave your homes. We hope you have a good day. God bless." I jumped at a sudden tap on the glass to my left. Sweet Mrs. Weller stood with a grateful smile and a steaming cup of coffee to replace what had spilled out of my travel mug, which was now rolling around on the passenger floorboards of the truck. I know this town is weird, and maybe even horrifying, but at the end of the day, I knew my neighbors would be around to lend a helping hand when needed. I drove back down the road, on my way to a warm egg sandwich with a travel mug full of steaming coffee, still feeling content with my simple little life. My name doesn't matter, but my story might. I was once a lead engineer at a top-secret research facility buried deep beneath the ice of Antarctica. Our mission was simple in theory, but perilous in practice: to explore and harness the power of an ancient technology buried miles below the frozen surface. We sought to understand it, to use it for the benefit of humanity. But what we discovered was something that should never have been awakened. The project, known as Obsidian, a code name that, in hindsight, was more fitting than we could have ever realized, began with the discovery of a massive, perfectly preserved structure detected via satellite scans. This structure, buried under 4 miles of solid ice, was unlike anything on Earth. It was an impossibly smooth, obsidian black pyramid that emitted faint electromagnetic pulses that seemed to hold the secrets of an unimaginable power. We didn't find it by chance. The world's greatest minds had been gathering data for years, piecing together ancient texts, myths, and legends that all seemed to converge on one point: Antarctica. There were whispers of an ancient civilization, long forgotten, that had possessed knowledge and technology far beyond anything we could comprehend. When the satellite scans revealed the pyramid, those whispers turned into an obsession. Every resource was diverted to uncovering the truth behind the structure. By December 2021, my team had been dispatched to the site with the most advanced drilling equipment known to man. We were isolated, cut off from the world, and our mission was classified at the highest levels of global security. Only a handful of people knew of our existence, and even fewer knew the true nature of our mission. The harsh Antarctic environment was unforgiving, but we were determined. We tunneled deeper, inching closer to the pyramid with each passing day. The pulses grew stronger as we descended, and soon our instruments began to behave erratically. Computers failed without explanation, compasses spun wildly, and our most advanced communication systems flickered and died. The closer we got, the more it felt as if the very laws of physics were bending, warping around the presence of the pyramid. On January 10th, 2022, we finally reached the pyramid's surface. It was a sight that defied reason. The surrounding ice had an unnatural, almost glossy sheen, as if it had been fused together by some incredible force. The air itself grew thick with static electricity, crackling and buzzing with an energy that made the hair on our necks stand on end. Every instinct screamed at us to turn back, to leave this place undisturbed, but we had come too far to stop. We set up our equipment, our minds torn between awe and dread, and prepared to enter the pyramid. The entrance was sealed with a door unlike anything we had ever seen. It was made from a material that defied all analysis. Neither metal nor stone, it absorbed all light, rendering it nearly invisible to the naked eye. We tried every method we could think of to breach it, from thermal drills to explosives, but nothing worked. It was as if the door existed in a state that was beyond our understanding. Finally, after days of frustration, the door seemed to react to the pulse of the pyramid itself, sliding open silently to reveal a dark passageway leading into the heart of the structure. The chamber we entered was vast, with walls lined with glyphs that emitted a dim, pulsating glow. The glyphs were unlike any language we had ever encountered, yet they seemed to carry a meaning that was just out of reach, teasing the edges of our consciousness. At the center of the room was a large, perfectly circular hole that descended into darkness. The air in the chamber was heavy, oppressive, as if the weight of eons pressed down on us. It was around this point that things began to spiral out of control. The glyphs on the walls began to pulse faster, their glow intensifying until it was almost blinding. The air grew thick, almost tangible, pressing down on us with a force that made it hard to breathe. We attempted to retreat, but the hole in the center of the room began to emit a low, thrumming noise, a sound that resonated deep within our bones, vibrating through the very core of our beings. As we watched, paralyzed with terror, something began to rise from the depths. It was a shape of pure void, darker than the darkest night, an absence of light and matter that seemed to consume everything around it. It was amorphous, constantly shifting, yet there was a terrifying sense of intelligence behind it, an ancient malevolence that had been waiting for this moment. The entity filled the room with an overwhelming presence, a crushing sense of despair and doom that threatened to obliterate our very sanity. The air warped and twisted around it, reality itself bending in its presence as the entity began to take a vaguely humanoid form. We were frozen, unable to move or speak, trapped in the grip of a terror that defied all reason. The only sound was the relentless hum, growing louder and more unbearable with each passing second, until it felt like our very skulls would shatter from the pressure. Then, in a voice that bypassed our ears and spoke directly into our minds, the entity said, "You have trespassed into the domain of the eternal void. You are the first to awaken us in eons, and for this, your world will suffer. We are the ones who came before, and we shall reclaim what was lost. You cannot stop what has begun." The words reverberated through our minds, leaving a trail of icy dread in their wake. The entity dissipated into the air, leaving us with a chilling coldness that seeped into our very souls, a coldness that no warmth could ever banish. We fled in blind panic, abandoning all our equipment and sealing the entrance behind us. But it was too late. The pyramid began to emit pulses of energy at an ever-increasing rate, each pulse sending shockwaves through the ice and the earth below. We realized with dawning horror that it was a beacon, a call to something far beyond our comprehension, something that was now stirring in response. Our retreat to the surface was a nightmare. The elevator that had taken us days to install now seemed like a coffin, its slow ascent punctuated by the groaning and creaking of the ice around us. When we finally emerged into the blinding white of the Antarctic day, it was with a sense of profound relief that quickly turned to despair. The sky was darkening, clouds swirling in unnatural patterns as the pulses from the pyramid continued to increase in frequency and intensity. The temperature dropped rapidly, plummeting to levels that even our thermal suits struggled to combat. Back at the facility, we initiated lockdown protocols. The base was designed to withstand the harshest conditions on Earth, but nothing could prepare us for what we had unleashed. Communication with the outside world was impossible. The pulses interfered with every frequency, cutting us off from the rest of humanity. We were alone, isolated in a frozen wasteland with a terror that defied all logic. Days passed in a blur of fear and confusion. My team members, one by one, began to succumb to the influence of the entity. It started with the dreams, nightmares that invaded our sleep, filled with visions of the void, of a world consumed by darkness and despair. Then came the voices, whispering insidious thoughts into our minds, eroding our will to resist. Some of my colleagues began to act strangely, their behavior erratic and unpredictable. They spoke of hearing the call, of feeling the pull of the pyramid, and before long, they would vanish into the snow, leaving no trace behind. I tried to keep us together, to maintain some semblance of order, but it was like trying to hold back an avalanche. The pulses grew stronger, and the base itself began to suffer. The walls creaked and groaned as the ice around us shifted. The temperature continued to drop, and the air grew thinner, as if the very atmosphere was being sucked away by the entity's presence. The power systems failed one by one, plunging us into darkness, and the backup generators struggled to keep up. The oppressive cold seeped into everything, turning the facility into a frozen tomb. I'm not sure when I realized I was the last one left. The days had bled into each other, time losing all meaning as the nightmare unfolded around me. I wandered the empty halls of the facility, my breath freezing in the air, my mind numb with exhaustion and terror. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant, ever-present hum of the pyramid's pulses. I tried to send a final message, a warning to anyone who might receive it, but I knew it was futile. The entity's influence had already spread too far. As I write this, I can feel the cold creeping closer, an icy hand reaching out to claim me. The pyramid pulses with a steady rhythm, a heartbeat that echoes through the earth and the sky. The end is coming, not just for me, but for all of humanity. We have set something in motion that cannot be stopped, a chain reaction that will reverberate across the globe. The Obsidian Pyramid is a gateway, a door to a world of darkness and despair, and we have opened it. I don't know how much longer I have, but if this message somehow reaches you, heed my warning. Do not attempt to access the Obsidian Pyramid. Do not go near it. Know that the end we have set in motion cannot be undone. Whatever comes next is beyond our understanding, beyond our control. Pray that it's not too late. Pray that somehow we can survive what is coming. But deep down, I know that the prayers are in vain. The eternal void has awakened, and it will consume us all. When Ben died, he made very little noise. It was the computers that alerted me. Shrill alarms and flashing lights. I hadn't even gotten out of my sleeping bag before my smartwatch had lit up with half a dozen messages about system failures. Astronaut 1, heart rate monitor failure. Astronaut 1, skin conductance monitor failure. Astronaut 1, VO2 monitor failure. The situation didn't sink in until I was shaking an unresponsive Ben. White eyes rolling back into his skull, blood pooling in his ears like red jelly. Viscosity, Massachusetts. No gravity. It made me nauseous to look at. HQ would later say Ben died from an aneurysm. 1 in a million. A freak death that just happened to occur in low Earth orbit. So what now? I asked after all the panic had died down and the reality of my situation finally settled in. HQ sent me a rarely used or discussed document that outlined what I'd have to do. Bodies pose a unique threat in microgravity, it explained. All that order becomes disordered. What is solid turns to liquid. What is liquid turns to gas. First thing I needed to do was to put Ben's body somewhere that had no oxygen and was freezing cold. Somewhere he would pose no danger to himself or me. Isolated, but easily retrievable. The conclusion was obvious. I knew what they'd suggest before I even reached that part of the booklet. It happened so fast that Ben was still warm when I put him in the special bag designed to endure the vacuum of space. I kept expecting him to protest as I pulled at stiffening limbs and manipulated swelling joints. Every step of the process, every zip, every bit of Velcro. I had to remind myself he wasn't going to complain. It felt intimate, but it wasn't. Intimacy requires two people. By that point, Ben was just meat. The spacewalk itself was something else. The bag that surrounded Ben's body inflated in the vacuum, and I instinctively felt the urge to undo what I'd done. There was a body in there, and bodies aren't meant to have so little between them and outer space. When I touched the bag, I could still feel him beneath the paper, thin material. The crease of an elbow, the bump of his nose. By the time I reached my destination, his body already felt brittle. Attaching him to the station was easy enough on a technical level. Leaving him there went against every instinct I had. After that, there was no pretending he was coming back. A day later, and I began to pack his things away. There was a catharsis in it that I found calming. I cataloged his belongings with thin detachment. Most of his things were dry and uninteresting. Photos of him with a dog, a copy of a Michael Shea book, a certificate of excellence from NASA that he received when he was 10. He discovered a comet, he'd told me during our first meeting. Backyard with a telescope. NASA let him name it and everything. That was how he knew he wanted to be an astronaut. Described it as a calling. Ben was like that. A real-life Boy Scout. In life, he'd had no edges. You'd think given our history, we'd be close. 2 men selected based on extensive psychological profiling. Together, we had simulated multiple missions to Mars, 2 on the ground, 1 in space. All of them highly secretive. An official mission to Mars was meant to be next, at which point the whole project would be made public. But the key to having 2 people work together, alone, for nearly an entire year, isn't to find 2 guys who are best friends forever. It's finding people who won't grate on one another. Neither hate nor love. 2 men who enjoy their own company, but don't mind one another. Ben and I had become acquainted over all that time together, but it wasn't like we were brothers in arms. We worked so well precisely because there was no meat to the friendship, no stakes, nothing to argue over. To me, Ben was a nice guy, but that was all. I figured he was plain and simple all the way down. No dark secrets, no real problems to speak of. The journal changed that. It was taped to the inside of a panel of a computer at his workstation. He must have hidden it close to his things, somewhere out of sight but easily retrievable. Frayed leaves and yellowed pages, like some ancient artifact. Last thing I expected to find in a space station. I almost mistook its leather cover for some sort of personal Bible, the sort of well-worn tome held up by a preacher making exclamations about the devil, but its insides were handwritten and hardly in keeping with a Bible. Scribbles, shapes, phrases repeated and dissected. Some of it was even in binary. It seemed like the ravings of a child or a lunatic. I thought it was maybe a mindfulness exercise. Empty-headed doodling to help him get his head straight during stressful moments. But that didn't explain why he'd hidden it, and why the numbers and pages seemed strangely organized. I don't know how to describe it exactly, except to say there was the vague impression that it meant something to the person who'd made it. Every last gram on a shuttle is accounted for. What you bring up with you, it can't be some random crap you want last minute. Ben would have had to clear the journal. I'm assuming he kept the contents secret. One look at what he'd been writing, and NASA would have had him in psych eval before the end of the day. But the book's size and weight would have had to be logged and accounted for. It could not have gotten on the station by accident, so I knew immediately that Ben had wanted it for something. I studied it for over an hour, trying to figure out what that was. Flicking from one page to the next, glaring at rows of numbers, strange fractals, something that looked like a cross between an eye and a textbook drawing of an atom. Given the way his writing and art skills developed throughout the book, I began to suspect he'd been adding to it since his childhood, which was just another layer to the growing mystery. I thought I was never going to get any insight into the book until, about 3/4 of the way through, I came across yet another page filled with rows and rows of numbers. Only this time, one of the strings was underlined, and a single word had been scratched, ragged and angry next to it. The only bit of English, or any human language, in all those pages. The only thing written in a way that could make sense to a living human. The word itself made me stop dead in my tracks, made my blood run cold. 170,318,042,636 aneurysm. The suspicion that came over me felt like a kind of madness. I told myself I had to be nuts when I checked the data from Ben's biomonitor, that I had to be crazy to even entertain the notion. But the information recorded by several different machines confirmed it. Ben's exact time of death was the 17th March 2018, 04:26 hours and 36 seconds. I don't think I moved for a good 15 minutes after that. Just stared at the data as my mind worked its way around a giant, impossible realization. Ben knew he was going to die. Of course, I tried to rationalize this. Anyone would. I came up with half a dozen reasons he'd written what he'd written. None of them were comforting, although they at least fit in with a more rational worldview. Take, for example, the idea that Ben had killed himself at that exact moment in time to meet some sort of prophecy he'd scrawled days or even hours before. Was that a good thing? What did it mean for me? Ignore the logistical issues. What poison can be timed to the second? Let's just say that's what he did. That left the hair-raising question of why. And there was no comfortable answer that I could see. Of course, I went through that book with a fine tooth comb looking for any more clues. I wish I hadn't. I eventually found another word, this one closer to the very end of the journal. Another date and timestamp, one that lay 6 weeks in the future, and another word scratched painfully into the paper by a clumsy fist. Immolation. Permission denied. I bit my lip and took a deep breath. What about the station's integrity? I asked. No sign of any issue from external cameras, they replied. I can hear something banging on the hull, I told them. Nothing is visible on the cameras. That's why I need to go take a look, I wrote. It's hard to argue with the computer. You can't shoot at a death glare. HQ could have easily arranged video calls, but really they wanted the distance, made it easier to say no. Solo spacewalk is incredibly dangerous, they quickly wrote back. Microphones in station hull are reporting nothing of concern. Usual impact from debris. Nothing that corroborates reports of external tapping. Permission for spacewalk is denied. I made no further response, but instead closed the screen and wondered if they were being entirely truthful. The tapping sound coming and going over the last few days was unmistakable, even over all those whirring machines and motors. Space stations are loud. They even give us earplugs to handle it. But whatever was out there was somehow louder. Or perhaps, given the circumstances, I was just sensitive to the thought of something, anything, out there. There was no denying it annoyed me. Just one of those sounds I found impossible to block out, like water dripping in a bathtub at 3 a.m. Tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. Tap. No sense of order. Not on the surface level, but something. Maybe. Underneath. Some sense or reason. Some kind of regularity that the brain detects and can't let go of. How could the microphones possibly miss it? Sleep was getting progressively difficult. At times, I thought the station under some kind of hidden stress. Materials freezing and warming in irregular ways. No atmosphere, no conduction of heat. Things get hot in the sun's rays. Objects warm and cool to both extremes. This is routine stuff for anything up in space, of course. But it didn't stop me thinking about all the ways the station was just a pile of metal that could come undone. Could break and tear. Bend and stretch. Like watching the wing of your plane wobble during turbulence, it's an uncomfortable reminder that you're just a monkey in a fancy toy. And what if something had come loose? Something. Oh, haha. At first I stuck to this notion strictly, asking myself what if some antenna or strap or bit of metal had gotten loose and was banging against the hull? That would be bad. But of course, that wasn't really what I was thinking. It's what I wrote to HQ about. Over and over and over. But what was really on my mind was the thought that maybe, somehow, he had gotten loose. And of course, that's not so silly, right? The specially designed bag he was in, the one that would vent any gases produced by decomposition while maintaining his body's integrity, was brand spanking new. Know how many times it had been tested? Never. Never ever. Ben was the first, so of course it might come loose. Just because it's space-age technology doesn't mean it's sophisticated. He was strapped to the outside like a Christmas tree to the family sedan. Maybe, I wondered, one of the straps had broken, and now he was thumping against the side every now and again. Never mind that there wasn't anything out there to prompt that kind of buffeting. No air, no wind. If he'd come loose, he'd just float a little farther away. But something was making that noise, and I worried almost constantly that it was him. Only problem was I had cameras. Lots. And all of them, every single time, showed the same thing. The bag barely changed from when I last saw it in person, strapped firmly and securely to the station's hull. This should have reassured me. Should have, but it didn't. Something was out there, tapping at the hull. On and off. No pattern, no reason, no correlation. It came and it went, seemingly choosing its moments to bother me the most. Sleep was difficult for multiple reasons. The tapping was bad enough, but lately my nightmares had taken a strange turn. Black, cold. In them I was trapped in a suffocating film. Freezing cold. Non-stop agony. Fighting furiously to free myself was this black void of a nightmare. Like all deeply terrible dreams, it colored my thoughts for the rest of the day, and each time I had it, it got harder to shake. I tried to endure, compartmentalize, take my mental turmoil and put it in a box, right unhinged across the lid, and sit rocking back and forth waiting for my rescue. And that was an option, a good one. But there was one little word that stopped me going the route of hunkering down and ignoring my own madness. Immolation. When HQ told me the date of the shuttle would reach me, I spent quite a bit of time wondering if this wasn't just some big experiment. The sheer coincidence of it all, the magnitude of it. They'd sent me the message, and the subject line had 3 exclamation points, like the communications officer on the other side couldn't wait to deliver good news for once. Let their professionalism slip. They'd finally arranged a shuttle to retrieve me after it was done dropping some guys off at the ISS. It was lucky it had come so soon. A stroke of logistical genius allowed them to sneak Ben and me back without it being too conspicuous. I should be very thankful, they told me. But I was just stunned. The date matched the one Ben had written out. Factoring in travel time, I'd be entering Earth's atmosphere at the exact time the prophesied moment would come and go. Ripe for an error, a misplaced heat pad, a mistimed thruster. Something, anything, to go wrong and leave me plunging to my death in a burning metal tube. Ripe for immolation. If it wasn't Ben out there tapping away, I wanted to know. I needed to know. I was a rational man, a skeptic. I did not believe the natural world would produce a man that could predict his death down to the minute or the second. Nor did I believe he could predict mine. But I am only an animal. I am made of meat. Vulnerable. A raw nerve in a world of jagged rocks. And I am risk-averse. That word, immolation, not random, not chance. Up in the void surrounded by pure oxygen, fire was a constant risk. Ben's little numbers loomed large in my mind. I had to make sure everything was in place. Had to make sure there were no errors. If it was a prediction, which I refused to accept at face value, then maybe I could take heart from it. What could Ben do in the face of an aneurysm? Nothing. But immolation, fire, an accident, that sort of thing could be avoided, just so long as everything was in working order. Just so long as everything was where it was meant to be. What did HQ know? Cameras and remote operators. Not enough. No one else was in that tin can except me. Why even have humans in space if you wouldn't trust their instincts and judgments? I needed to know what was making that noise. I needed to get out there. HQ caught on too late. I was inside the suit, the airlock cycling by the time they realized. I chose my timing well. Halfway through my maintenance shift, told them I was taking a look at the suit, make sure everything was in order. Meant they were slow to catch on to what I was doing. Technically, they could stop the process at any stage. They could do anything from their side. But I threatened to force a manual override that would shut them out from that part of the system. They told me they'd court-martial on return, but but that was a piss-weak threat. For me, the stakes were higher than a court-martial. In the end, they backed down. Know how hard it is to build a space station in secret. It came first. If the spacewalk went wrong and I died, the station would still be there. $1 billion asset awaiting the next top-secret mission. It was my neck on the line, not theirs. I accepted it. Under time pressure, HQ accepted it too. By the time the door finally opened, and I was able to gently guide myself out and around the rim so that I was clinging onto the station's exterior, they'd already tapped into the cameras and were guiding me along to my destination. But it was background noise to me at that point. Their voices and little pings, constant readouts of suit temperatures and the distance to the station hull. Meaningless, all of it. What mattered was the sound. Tap, tap, tap. I was anxious by this point, or perhaps, if I'm honest, scared. Space is all extremes, not just heat, but light too. The shadows cast are vast and strange. You move in and out of the Earth's shadow like it's a hand in front of a projector. And the ones cast by yourself and your surroundings are a special kind of black. The station, with its myriad of pipes and cables, was covered in abyssal shadows. Long, warped things with ambiguous origins. Sometimes I looked at the darkness and wondered if there was anything there at all, or if the station was simply bisected by some kind of strange cosmic force, like I might fall into it somehow, forever lost. Normally, I'd think it was beautiful. Spacewalks had, for me, in the past, been an almost religious experience. This carried the same sense of weight, but for very different reasons. I felt watched, something I tried to ignore, but it got harder and harder. Kept looking over my shoulder. Kept overthinking every little bump and vibration I felt on the station's hull. By the time I reached the place where I had strapped Ben's body, I was close to a panic attack. That whole part of the station was covered in darkness, the kind where I couldn't see a damn thing. It was only HQ's voice telling me I'd reached my destination that let me know Ben was lying just a few feet from me. Under their direction, I found him, and when my light fell upon the bag itself, I saw the metallic fabric glitter with ice. Touching it, I felt Ben's frozen body inside. Hard as rock. I gave him a nudge, and he didn't move an inch. The straps holding him in place were still there, firm as ever. What else could be causing the sound? I asked. There is one option. The nameless voice on the other end sounded reticent, but that had been the default since Ben died. HQ always sounded like they were holding something back. What's that? We are not 100% certain how corpses would respond to the changing temperatures in vacuum. Obviously, parts of the body will freeze and expand, fluids in particular. Right now, the bag has a lot of surface contact with the metallic hull. One theory is that blood may be freezing and sublimating as the surface beneath changes temperature. I looked at the bag and grimaced. How much blood, exactly? We cannot possibly say for certain how much would have left the body, only that the bag's job is to contain it until return. We are able to confirm using instruments in the station that the panel you are standing on is well below freezing. Everything should be in a manageable state, so to speak. Solid, likely one large clump. They replied, and then after a moment they added, "You wanted this. It would be a waste of resources now that you're out here not to investigate further. You need to look inside." Of course I'd wanted this, hadn't I? To satisfy my morbid curiosity. To address the rabid thoughts in my mind that had kept me awake, filling what little sleep I had with nightmares. Now that I was at the threshold, I found myself so afraid that even moving my hand took a kind of effort. And yet I had no choice. I had to see this through. The bag opened with a specially designed zipper. No sound, but I could feel the click, click, click of the specialized teeth opening up. It's stupid, but as I unfurled the flap, I could have sworn a terrible fetid stench passed over me. It lasted no more than a few seconds, but was so vivid I turned and snapped my eyes shut as they watered. Power of suggestion, I told myself as I reopened them. That was all. Nothing more. No air, no sound, no smell. I took a few deep breaths, tried not to let the incident unsettle me further, and looked inside the bag. Multiple people watching my video feed gasped while I made a fairly unflattering noise somewhere between a moan and a cry. I'd expected something. God, at worst, I'd expected something ghoulish. Blue skin, icicles collecting around the eyelashes, like a body found in the Arctic. But Ben had transformed. Great jagged shards of frozen blood had erupted from the eyes and ears and mouth, his jaw dislocated to an unnatural angle as an icicle the size of my forearm forced its way out. His neck was broken, his torso shredded with strips of flesh hanging off in ribbons, and his hands were clawing at his face with bizarre yellow nails. They'd even left grooves in his skin. What the fuck is this? I asked no one in particular, only to realize that HQ had been talking amongst themselves the whole time. A malfunction in the bag. Unexpected pressure. Temperature changes. No, this isn't normal. Let's not pretend this is normal. Guys, I shouted, splitting the chatter and leaving silence. Why are his arms like that? Muscle spasms, possibly caused by, well, whatever caused the unusual reaction in his circulatory system. Maybe that caused his arms to curl up towards his face. There are scratch marks on his cheeks, I replied. Skin under his nails. Are we sure he was dead when I brought him out here? A dozen urgent, alarmed voices, all desperate to avoid even the slightest hint of responsibility, told me no, that was not possible. But looking down at Ben's tortured face, I couldn't help but feel a bit of doubt. I was about to ask what I ought to do next when the sun rose across the station. Unlike Earth, this wasn't a gentle morning. It flipped like a light switch. Thankfully, the suit reacted before it had a chance to blind me, but the temperature began to rapidly climb. I watched as something beneath Ben's skin began to writhe in the new warmth. It's definitely not normal. We can offer no further insight into the situation as of this moment. The footage you're sending us is under review by a panel of experts, HQ told me, somewhat urgently and robotically, like the person on the other end was stifling panic. Current orders are to take samples, reseal the bag, and return to the station. You sure I should be taking this stuff inside? There was some mumbling before the same operator replied. Forget samples. Seal the bag. Return to the station. Gladly, I replied, before pulling the zipper shut. I was keen to leave and made the journey back faster than I should have. That crawling sensation you feel when being watched, it was all over me. Made me clumsy and I knocked myself more than once on the way back, like I was suddenly unused to the suit's controls. I just couldn't escape the notion that everywhere I looked, someone or something had darted back just out of view. Of course, that was impossible, so I told myself. What could survive out in space? But it only made it that much worse to imagine something slinking into the shadows, tapping on the hull, stalking me every step of the way back. When I finally reached the door, the tension inside me rose. If something was going to happen, it would happen now with my back turned on infinity. I had never felt so vulnerable. Reynolds. The sound made me jump. I'd been so focused on my surroundings, I'd forgotten I was being supervised by a room full of people 1,000 miles away. What is it? Reynolds. We're seeing something here we're not sure of. Being told you should hold off on returning. Something about the voice on the other end made my stomach sink. They didn't just sound confused, and make no mistake, when you're clinging to the side of a station. All on your own, confused would have been bad enough. But no, there was something else. Fear. There's an anomaly, they added. No one down here knows how to proceed. We're currently seeking input from higher-ups. This is unprecedented. What's going on? It began with, well, signals from some of the biomonitors, specifically Ben's. That last word hit like a truck. What? Yes, and the cameras are... At first, we thought they were malfunctioning. It appeared as if Ben's bag was empty. And then, Reynolds, we noticed something else. Guys, what's going on here? I'm being told I can't say more. Just wait. I tightened my grip on the railing, my heart pounding. Finally, the door cycled open, and I was ready to disregard all orders when the man speaking to me from HQ practically screamed in my ear. Don't enter, Reynolds. Doctor, not. Enter the station. What we're seeing on the cameras, you can't let that in. If something's out here, I'm getting to safety before it reaches me. Tap, tap, tap. I stopped. My brain processed. I'd heard that. I'd heard something in the vacuum of space. I looked around at my hands, my feet. That couldn't be possible. Not unless... Tap, 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 tap. Without moving my head, I turned my eyes towards the very edge of my helmet's vision and watched as a single yellow fingernail tapped gently on the glass. The man in HQ spoke in a terrifying whisper. "He's on your suit." The terror that shot through me was electric, white fire coursing through my veins. Without even thinking, I reacted like I just found out there was a grenade strapped to my back. All instinct, no rationality. I cried out and swung around, trying to knock Ben off my back, but all I accomplished was setting off some alarms as I damaged my suit. "Get it off!" I screamed at no one in particular. "Get it off me!" I thrashed desperately and felt something shuffling around the exterior of the bulky suit. Finally, my eyes fell on something useful. The jet controls. I fumbled my hands into place and immediately blasted myself into the open pressure chamber, turning at the last minute so that the back of the suit smashed into the thick secondary door. I only hoped that whatever was clinging to the back of me was destroyed by the impact. But when I looked up, Ben was still out there gawping at me with a mouthful of frozen blood. Slowly, his movement packed with the eerie confidence of a predator, he prepared to enter the station. "Reynolds, get away from the door. We're initiating an emergency shutdown." Ben had one hand inside when the door slammed shut and cut it off. Even in space with the bulkhead between us, I could have sworn I heard him scream. There was no ignoring Ben or the sounds he made. Not anymore. Terrible thumps that battered the station, their location changing seemingly at random. This drove the people on the ground insane. Oh, I'd heard my fair share of rationalization over the last few hours. Been sent books worth of written material from every type of expert you could imagine. Ever since my colleague's death, I'd been wrestling with all sorts of bizarre thoughts. But after the spacewalk, it was like they'd spilled out of my head and were now terrorizing other like-minded skeptics. Try as they might, no one in HQ could make sense of it. But they didn't have the journal. After what happened during my spacewalk, it became a priority for me to figure out what the fuck was going on. Those numbers Ben had recorded weren't gibberish. I'd sort of known that from the start. To read them was to feel like you were reading another language, something secret and hidden. And while I never cracked the code, not even now after all this time, I did figure out where Ben had found it. Light. The trick was to dig deeper into Ben's research. Specifically a pet project of his he'd spent nearly his entire life chasing. A little comet, a ball of ice, way out in the Kepler belt close to where the solar system abates and the great cosmic void begins. Something small and insignificant that rotated and shifted and occasionally caught the sun, bouncing photons right back at us. A glittering snowball so faint as to be invisible unless you happen to look at the right place at the right time, like Ben did when he was just 10 and playing with hobbyist Dad's backyard telescope. a light in the darkness, a light that spoke to a few instruments Ben had adjusted to record each little emission. Flash on, flash off, flash on, flash off, flash on, tap, tap, tap. Binary to hexadecimal, and from there, God, something else, something that spoke to him, something out there had spoken to him. I don't know what scared me more. The sound of a reanimated Ben pounding away at the station, an imminent, all too near threat, or the thought of something in the void whispering unknown secrets to a man for the last 2 decades. An idea that occasionally rose over me like the tide, swallowing me whole if I dwelt on it for more than a few moments. I never did figure out what the transmission was saying, but I was transfixed nonetheless. Not just by Ben's little journal that contained hundreds, thousands of handwritten records, but the live transmission he had set up on his computer, the one he'd converted into a sound. It was like an earworm on steroids, like white noise made of acid, a flood of alien ideas that left me confused and drooling if I listened for too long. All told, I spent no more than a few days with access to that transmission, and by the end I felt like I was on the verge of melting away. But Ben had been exposed to that thing since his childhood, spent years and years listening and recording and waiting, working towards something none of us could really hope to understand. I had to assume that transmission was responsible for his death, and even worse, what had happened to him afterwards. Had it always been the reason for his coming to space? Had the Ben I'd known just been a sham? The sound, the light coming from out there. It felt wrong. It wasn't a gentle lull or a siren's pull. It was dark and overpowering. Why had he given in to it? Why had he done everything it wanted? How much of his life had been lived because of its needs and wants? One thing I could be sure of as I spent days listening to Ben's furious rampage on the exterior of the station, whatever had spoken to him. It was hostile, and it couldn't be allowed to come back with me. Reynolds, I'm being told this is going to be a bit of unconventional pickup. I scoffed as I finished suiting up. That was an understatement. What did they tell you? I asked as I pulled the helmet down and initiated the door's opening sequence. There are concerns about contamination, the pilot told me. Not sure what that means. Didn't say if it was biological or chemical. All sounds a little weird if you ask me. But we're meant to pick you up mid-spacewalk, is that right? Yup, I replied. Huh, you up for that? We're told we can come about 200 meters away, but you'll have to close the rest with the suit's thrusters. Gonna be something else for you. Untethered journey from one vehicle to the next. It's never been done before. I'm well aware of the risks, I said. Just keep your eyes peeled. This time it was his turn to scoff. For what? He cried. You'll know it when you see it. I made the journey with my back to the shuttle, floating in the wrong direction at a slow but consistent speed. My eyes glued to the station, looking for some signs of Ben. There was the occasional flash of something red, a slight shimmer of movement, often obscured by some of the station's panels and antennae, that let me know he was still on the exterior, skulking around somewhere. So long as he stayed there, I knew I'd be okay. But the entire time I kept waiting for the other foot to drop, for the tension to finally explode into that life-threatening danger I knew was waiting for me. It came as a surprise when I finally approached the shuttle without incident. Pilot told me I was a few meters away, and it was time to turn around, so I did, drifting around as gently as a diver returning to the surface. I had my back to the station no more than a few seconds when the pilot grunted. Huh, that's odd. He sounded nonchalant, but the object that hit me was anything but minor. Ben, uninterested in making the journey safely, had launched himself off the station as fast as he could, and with no way of slowing down, he hit me at full speed, slamming me up against part of the door frame and sending us both tumbling out into the void before anyone had even had the time to register his attack. This time he was not letting me get a door between us. He scrambled over my suit like a deranged insect, one that I desperately tried to swat away as the great void spun around us both. Stars turned to lines, the shuttle swooping past my helmet's field of view in almost random directions. It was sickening and terrifying, and I hoped to God I'd be able to correct the spin before it got out of control, but all of that came second to the monster who was clinging to my suit. At some point he crawled around in such a way that I got a good look at him, the first in a few days. It was up close, personal. Even with the helmet's glass between us, I could make out such stark and startling detail that I momentarily froze in terror, aware only vaguely of the pilot's panicked transmissions. Jesus Christ, what the fuck is that thing? Reynolds, you need to get yourself stabilized. Much further, and we won't be able to help. And whatever you do, you need to know that fucking thing isn't coming aboard this shuttle. I wanted to reply, but I was busy trying to get an arm between me and Ben, who was now a profusion of jagged red crystals of varying sizes. Some as big as kitchen knives, others like sewing needles. A spacesuit's worst nightmare. A puncture wouldn't lead to the immediate decompression you're probably thinking of. Instead, I'd have a few moments at most before the air enveloping the suit dissipated, and after that my lungs would collapse, my blood would start to boil, and the water inside my eyes, nose, ears, and other soft tissues would vaporize and try to escape, like frostbite on fast forward. But punctures weren't my sole concern. I knew I had to stop Ben's hands getting a grip on the helmet. I don't know if whatever had animated him had access to all his memories, but Ben sure as shit knew how to remove a helmet from the exterior, so all my focus went on keeping his nasty little fingers away from my neck. A puncture would still leave me enough time to return to the shuttle, but with no helmet, I'd be doomed to a very painful death. So I fought the best I could, knowing everything hinged on me pushing him away. But Ben was lithe and insectile, constantly slipping out of reach whenever I got close to giving him a good shove. His fingers could easily find purchase on the suit and its many little greebles, while I was basically wielding oven gloves that offered no dexterity. I had no hope of shaking him off the usual way, but I did have something on my side. Inertia. The whole time we'd been spinning furiously, and that rotational force was just about the only thing trying to peel the two of us apart. So far I'd been fighting it, but why? I realized at the last moment I had one option left, so I jammed half thrusters on and decided to make the nearly out-of-control spin much, much worse. Normally, an uncontrolled spin is one of those nightmare scenarios any astronaut dreads. Humans are irregularly shaped, and once you start rotating along more than one axis, applying more force is likely just to make it worse. Correcting takes a huge amount of experience and insight, and even then there's no guarantee you can stop it. More likely is that by the time you figure out what you need to do, the rotational forces will have you on the brink of unconsciousness. And from there, death is just a stone's throw away. For me, it was the only chance I had. So I accelerated the spin and kept accelerating, holding the button down until the forces at play pulled Ben further and further towards the front of the suit. That's where inertia wanted us. Two objects in near symmetry, ready to break off in opposite directions at any moment. Ben held on for longer than I did. At some point, my limbs went weak, my vision dark, and my arms fell to my side, no longer able to fight the monster off. But by then, it took everything Ben had just to cling on to me, and he could no longer attack or fumble at my helmet. Eventually, even he had to give in as the spin grew faster and faster, and the forces trying to separate us grew too strong. It was like every roller coaster I'd been on merged into one and ramped up to 11. The last thing I remembered before I lost consciousness was the sight of Ben's monstrous face being flung off into the void. I came to aboard the shuttle, several men and women crowded around me. Jesus Christ, you're a lucky son of a bitch. I groaned and made eyes towards the person who had spoken. It sounded like the pilot. Nice to put a face to the voice. I don't feel lucky, I gasped, You spun right towards us. We were already suited up and on our way. Timed up well. That suit was riddled with holes. Any later, and we wouldn't have been around to catch you and get you into safety. As it is, pal, you're going home. Medical check shows no real issues. I think you're going to be okay. Where's Ben? The people around me shared a funny look before one of them realized. Benjamin Waitley, the other astronaut on board. Is that what? Who was attacking you? I nodded. Well, he's gone, they replied. If that really was your colleague, we're sorry. I feel like there's a story we're missing. I'll catch you up when I'm feeling better, I coughed. Well, whatever happened to him, he'll be re-entering Earth's atmosphere in the next hours, the pilot replied. What then? I asked. The pilot thought for a second. Human body on re-entry? He'll go up in flames. Immolation. There were bright flashes of red in the sky. It's as if someone was waving around a flare light from space, faint but noticeable. We all made UFO jokes and laughed as we nailed our tents into the ground. I knew for sure that there were 5 of us. We have all been friends since early middle school, and we're celebrating our high school graduation with this getaway camping trip. The flashes of red must have stopped randomly as we made conversation while fixing up our tents. Dave managed to put his tent together the fastest and told us he was going to find some branches for the fire. I remember how he had worked with me at the local gas station last year. We used to do the night shift together, and it had made working at a desolate gas station much more fun than it was supposed to be. There was also Eric in the corner, still reading his tent manual, fidgeting with his signature round glasses. I wasn't as close with Eric as I was with the others, but I still remember sitting with him in math class and copying his homework one time. Ava was also there talking with Sally, my cousin. Both had decided to team up and work on one tent at a time. I also have clear memories of them, hanging around at school in our usual places. In fact, I even knew Ava's younger brother, as he used to beg to go with us wherever we went. I bring all this up because I'm sure that there were 5 of us, including me, and that I knew everyone in the group. So Dave had went to get some branches as we pulled out some foldable chairs and set them up around the fire pit. I remember feeling uneasy as the sun set and darkness began to consume the forest. The shadows of trees elongated around us as the minutes ticked by. Eric went to get a flashlight from his bag while we wondered what was taking Dave so long. He appeared soon after, the harsh rustling sounds of the bushes signifying his return. We were all buried in our chairs at this point, covered by our jackets. The temperature had dropped quickly and a slight breeze was beginning to pick up. Geez, you guys weren't even bothered to pull out a chair for me, Dave said as he arranged all the branches in the pit. We had set up 5 chairs around the fire. I tried to rationalize the situation, but no matter how hard I focused, my head felt like it was underwater. I had perfect clarity up until that moment, but when I tried to focus on why 5 chairs were occupied when Dave hadn't sat down yet, my head seemed to just stop working, as if something was reaching in and pulling out my thoughts. Instinctually, I felt even more uneasy now, and I had placed why. The whole forest had gone dead silent. I looked around at the faces of the others and could tell that they had felt the same. Eric was fidgeting with his fingers, trying to scan around the group and spot the extra person, but it was futile. I scanned every face, each etched in worry and frowning in frustration, except for... It's... All right, I'll get the chair myself, Dave said, breaking the silence and somewhat alleviating the tension. I got up and offered to help him. He looked into my eyes and nodded knowingly. We headed away from the fire pit towards the tents, but I kept my eyes glued on our group. How many people are here? I whispered to Dave as he looked around and realized that we had indeed only packed 5 chairs. In fact, every person had brought with them their own chair. They were heavy to carry, and we wouldn't bring any extra needlessly. There's 5, right? I There's 5 chairs, Dave replied. His voice wavered as he spoke. No, I just think maybe one of us forgot our chair, I said. My mind was struggling to address the issue head-on and now sought to find rational excuses instead. I didn't quite feel in control of my thoughts. It felt like swimming in a dream, and if I tried to force myself to think about who the 6th person was, my head would begin to throb. Yeah, that sounds about right, actually, Dave said, relaxing and heading back to the group. When we walked back to the fire pit and circle of chairs, 2 chairs were empty. One for me and one for Dave. Everything was adding up now, even though we all agreed it wasn't before. Sally suggested we were all probably tired after the long hike to get here and probably just needed some sleep. She could have been right. We were all sleep-deprived from waking up very early today to make it on time. Ava brought out the drinks. The whole 6-pack was emptied. We all moved closer to the crackling fire for warmth as we took sips from our cans and reminisced on memories of last year. Ava was in the middle of telling us about that one time she was home alone with weird things happening in her house when I got these sudden chills despite the pleasant warmth of the fire. What felt cozy and safe moments ago felt wrong now, all because I realized that there was a crucial detail I missed. Who started the fire? Zrenya, I asked, completely interrupting Ava in the middle of her story and breaking everyone else's immersion. Everyone looked momentarily annoyed until they realized they had no answer. Once again, I scanned the faces staring back at me. All barely illuminated by the light from the fire, all familiar and pale from fear. Wasn't it you, Dave? Eric asked. Dave shook his head. I think the person standing behind Jenny did it, Sally said, looking over at me. I whipped my head around so quickly it hurt. My heart was pounding in my ears. There was nothing behind me except for the encompassing darkness of the woods. Staring at those tall, dark trees behind me made me feel exposed. I felt like a lost bird in a vast field. Wait, I don't know, Sally said. Her eyes had gone wide and she was shaking visibly. She continued to look around frantically as Ava moved over to her, placing her hands on her shoulders and trying to calm her down. I think we should leave this place, Ava stuttered. Yeah, something just doesn't feel right, but I can't put my finger on it, Dave said. But it's so dark out in the forest now, we'd probably get lost if we leave now. Someone else said, yeah, I think we should stay the night and leave as soon as we can tomorrow. Eric agreed. I tried to protest but realized Eric was right. The woods harbored an oppressive darkness within which navigation would be near impossible. Let's not sleep in our separate tents just to be safe, Sally said. We all agreed. We only brought 1-person tents with us, but we could squeeze 2 if we tried. That way no one would be alone at night. Following this conversation, we all got up and made our pairs. I went with Dave and Sally like always went with Ava. Eric kept complaining that he didn't have a pair, but we reassured him he did. He wouldn't accept it. I feel like at some point we all realized that there were only 5 of us, and suddenly we were all huddling up in the middle of the clearing. Why do we keep thinking there are 6 of us here? Eric asked. Sweat was dripping down his face despite the cold. We had nearly left him all alone on his own, under the assumption that there was another person. My stomach turned as I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to mentally recap everyone here. My head throbbed, but I kept pushing it. There's me, Dave, Eric, Ava, Sally, and... I was pointing at each of them as I said the name. I retched and emptied the contents of my stomach on the ground when I got past Sally. The left side of my head felt like there was a knife stuck in it. My vision was blurry. Dave held me up to stop me from collapsing, and we all wordlessly started to move towards the tents as someone put the fire out. Dave helped me into a tent, while the 4 outside discussed what to do. I could only focus on snippets of the conversation as the excruciating pain beating against my skull came and went in waves. Sally had the brilliant idea of arranging 3 tents together so their openings faced together at right angles in a sort of U shape, so we could sleep as close as possible and also limit the entrance to our tents. Dave was about to go to help as they worked outside, but I clutched his hand and asked him to stay with me. The tents took some time to arrange. I started to feel a bit better once everyone got settled into their tents. A quick head count confirmed there were 5 of us. Eric would have to sleep in his tent alone, but he was more comfortable with it since all the tents were very close now. Looking back now, I think he was just trying to put a brave face on for us. I regret that moment deeply, letting him sleep in his tent alone. He was always less integrated in our group and knew that none of us would pair with him. Just before going to bed, we all agreed to leave as soon as the sun rose in the morning. I remember taking one last look outside the tent into the forest before trying to fall asleep. The wind had picked up and the tree branches were swaying gently. Beyond our clearing was just pure darkness. It felt like the trees were closing in on me. With the faint moonlight illuminating our clearing, I turned my head to look over at the 2 tents we had left out and saw someone standing next to them. Despite the circumstances, sleep came quickly and easily. Ava's shrill scream woke me up in the middle of the night. Dave and I ripped our tent door open to find Sally and Ava looking into Eric's tent. We pushed them aside. Eric's sleeping bag was rolled up. He was still inside it. His head in the center, face contorted in utter agony. The rest of his body rolled around it with the blue fabric now dripping with dark blood. Dave zipped up the door of the tent. Ava was in shock. Her eyes had become glassy and unfocused. Sally was shaking her repeatedly, tears streaming down her face. Dave picked up his torch and yelled at us to get up and run. We left the campsite behind and entered the trail we had come from. The 5 of us huddled together, Dave leading in the front as he cast his weak flashlight over the path so we could see it. All we had to help us get through this 2-hour trail was a small white circle of light. Even the moon failed to illuminate our surroundings through the dense foliage. Ava tripped and fell, twisting her ankle. We came to a stop. Someone said they knew how to splint it so we could keep going. They dragged her into the woods instead. It happened too quickly for any of us to process. Sally was about to run after Ava when Dave held her back. She struggled and managed to free herself, running into the trees to follow the echoes of Ava's screams. I was about to run after her, but Dave held me by the shoulders and shook me hard. "We need to get out of here, Jenny, please," he said. I hesitated but jolted into motion again when Sally's voice was cut off abruptly. She had been calling out Ava's name as she ran after her. Dave and I continued to run down the trail, trying to get to our car so we could get out of here. There was nothing we could do. At some point, there were 3 of us running on the trail, Dave and I shoulder to shoulder, while someone followed us closely behind. "Dave, who's behind us?" I gasped. My heart was threatening to burst through my ribcage and my legs burned. He turned to look at me. Confusion transformed into fear on his face and then into rage. "You keep running," he told me as he produced a pocket knife from his pants. He handed me the car keys, which I nearly dropped. Then he turned around suddenly and jumped at whoever was behind us. I continued to run in fear as the sounds of a struggle grew behind me. I tripped and tumbled through the trail for what felt like hours. I didn't allow myself to stop. I almost cried when the trail ended and I walked out into the familiar car park. Not wasting a second, I ran to the car and started it up, accelerating out of that forest and onto the highway within mere seconds. I'm typing this post out at a rest stop. My phone has finally regained service, and I've called 911 to try and explain the situation. I don't think they believe my version of events, but they sent a car my way regardless. As I wait, the sun is finally starting to rise. After I hit the post button on this, I'm gonna check why the person in my back seat has been so silent the whole time. I work at the Lone Star Diner, off the road from Carson City to Reno. Diner name has of course been changed for obvious reasons. More on that later. Why do I work at the Lone Star Diner, off the road from Carson City to Reno? Well, because, kind stranger, my life plans didn't work out. Generally, if you're caught working at a diner past college specifically, one in the middle of nowhere, it might mean that things aren't going so hot. But still, why this diner? Why Lone Star specifically? I'm aware you probably aren't actually asking these questions, but I nonetheless believe they deserve a response. Of all of the diners in the world, what makes Lone Star so special is the pay. The pay is fucking great. There are maybe 10 other diners within a 30-minute drive from where I live. Most of them average out to a little over minimum wage. Meanwhile, Lone Star is whipping up a mean $50 an hour. And that hourly rate is due to one single, solitary reason, no matter what anyone tells you. Because of him. My first day on the job was fine, more or less. I'd worked customer service before, so I felt like I could run with the strange surprises that came unique to diners. I was able to adapt to the inconsistency of the rules pretty quickly. Unwritten rules like some areas in the restaurant need to be spotless at all times. Others boss lady couldn't give less of a shit about. Serve customers quickly. But not too quickly, asshole. Customers here don't actually like it when you show up too fast. Give them some time to feel the floor under their boots, to miserably stare ahead and mourn what could have been. You know, diner stuff. They're here because they want to be alone. Pardon the contradiction. Of course, vaguely defined, whispered only by ghosts. Rules extended to the cooks as well. If you were, somehow secretly, celebrity chef Marco Pierre White in the flesh, your mandate was to keep your damn prowess to yourself. Your job is to make the classics as decently as possible. Not bad, but not amazing. Just poor enough to be really good. That's what the customers are here for. As the weeks unfolded, I rose, or I suppose, crouched to the occasion quite well. You want intentional, pinpoint precision mediocrity? You've come to the right person. Most of the patrons just wanted coffee and brunch, brought to them at medium speed, with a semi-predictable cadence of waiter or waitress check-ins afterwards. Done, done, and done. Not one for subtlety. One day I finally decided to ask my boss the question in the middle of a shift. I didn't want to ruin a good thing by doubting it, but fuck me if I wasn't a little curious. Not a full look at the gift horse's mouth, more of a skeptical side-eye. Why $50 an hour? She didn't even look up from her task at the register, methodically counting out bills. Said it on your first day, you gotta be good at following the rules. And when it's an important rule, you better be damn well perfect. High expectations here. I made a face. Right, high expectations. You think I'm joking? No, ma'am, I guess. Why did I even speak up? I just think you're running a really cool operation here. Cooler than you might realize. It's still work, but the whole thing seems fair. Christ, my waffling skills were abysmal. Add that to the list of intentional mediocrity. Booyah. She looked up from her duties and shot me a stern look. I don't run this ship, and following the rules here means that you take care of yourself. I'm sorry. I am your employer, sure, and I'll pay you well to be here, sure. But you should be aware, there is plenty more going on here than just you in this diner. She glanced down at her watch, then sighed. I usually save this speech for the end of the month, but you already caught me halfway through it. So, the Cole's notes. If you don't think you have it in you to follow instructions clearly, without protest, and without asking too many questions, then you should leave. Quit. No harm, no foul. A week's worth of pay on the house. The conversation sputtered shortly after that. I tried to find an opening to ask more about what she meant, but but she was closed off to the topic moving forward. And you know what? That was fine. If she wanted me to put my head down and just do the work, I could do that. And work I did. And things were good. Mundane small talk with the customers was fun. My co-workers were friendly, and I was getting paid well. I'd found a place to park the failures of my life, a place to build from. It must have been a Saturday, I think, when I first noticed him. An occupied seat in the far corner of the diner. No idea how long he'd been sitting there and waiting, though he certainly looked patient. I had the strange inkling that he'd been left hanging for quite some time, though I couldn't actually remember seeing him enter. Brown corduroy shirt, short hair, mid-50s it seemed, a reasonably calm smile, normal-looking dude. I started making my way out from the back and headed towards him. Immediately, I felt a tight grip on my arm. It was Melanie, my boss, with a forceful clutch enough to make me drop my notepad. Her fingers tightened around my forearm, sharply pinching my skin. "Important rules," she said. "What?" "You remember our chat about rules? Well, this is the most important one, okay?" "Okay. That man over there, in the corner." She motioned to the man who had caught my attention, sitting upright, hands softly clasped together, coy smile across his face. "You don't go up to him. You don't say a word to him. But he's a customer." Her hold intensified. She was hurting me, almost as if she was taking out some sort of unseen anger on me. "I'd like to ask you right now to be smart enough to not ask questions and just follow instructions. You don't go to his table. You don't talk to him. You can look at him. You can shout across the room at him if you'd like, though I can't imagine why you'd ever need to do that. But you do not approach him, and you do not take his order." Or a sharp exhale through the nose, a shake of the head, and a glare from my manager. It's different every time, but it ain't pretty. I watched him from the short distance I'd been afforded. It was hard not to. She did too. Unlike the other customers here, I didn't get a sense that he was here to be alone, to reminisce, or to take part in the comfort ritual of a lackluster Eggs Benedict over rye. Instead, I had the sense that he was just curious, mild-mannered, content, but curious. My shift ended not too long after, so I didn't actually get a chance to watch him leave. Regardless, the experience of seeing him and learning about the rule he was connected to left a bizarre, dampening feeling on my mood. I liked my job. I liked coming home and unwinding. I didn't mind being in the middle of nowhere. It felt nice to look up at the empty sky filled with stars, to see them shimmer and shine, and even occasionally shoot across. I made a wish that things in my life would stay simple. I started to get a sense of his cadence. He'd usually show up once a month. The rare times I got to see him, I'd try to squeak in the odd question to my boss. Questions like, who is he? Where does he come from? And has anyone spoken with him? All mechanically met with, I don't know, and if you're scared, you're welcome to quit. Then, as fate would have it, one day Boss Lady fell incredibly ill. My co-workers and I had to convince her to go home midway through her shift, her sickness falling, uncomfortably, within the usual 1 to 3 day window at the end of the month when our customer would typically appear. And of course, there he was, right after she went home. To my benefit, the other waiters and waitresses working the rounds were well aware of his presence and knew exactly what to do whenever he arrived. All of them knew to steer clear of him. Nevertheless, driven by a foundational curiosity that I just couldn't shake, I used this opportunity to go for it. I shouted a single thing across the floor, knowing Melanie wasn't there to chide me. "Hello, sir. What brings you here?" I asked him. He turned his head from his fixed position in his seat and put a hand to his ear. Clever. I said, "What brings you here?" I called out again, a few notches louder this time, garnering some odd looks from our Thursday patrons. To my surprise, he spoke back. I'm not sure why I was expecting his voice to carry the tone of some twisted, demented demon. Maybe the fear Melanie had instilled in me. The man sounded exactly how he looked. "I'm sorry, dear," he said. "I'm afraid I'm not sure what you're saying. Can you come over here and ask me again?" "Nope. I was good. And I don't mean to be rude about the service," he continued, "but it feels as if no one has taken my order for quite some time now." I let the exchange end there, diverting my attention back to the other guests. As always, he'd eventually disappear without fanfare, without the clatter of the entrance bell or any sight or sound of his steps across the diner floor, our backroom conversations about him remaining dreadfully short while he was there. Just, he's here, and he's gone. And the odd, when we really needed to say it, I feel really weird about this. It took me a while to understand where my brazenness to address this strange middle-aged man came from. In truth, I was just afraid. His presence and all of the questions tied to his being at our diner were disrupting this otherwise great arrangement that I felt I had. It seemed right, in the moment, to stand at the very edge of my bravery and say something to him. Of course, now that he was gone, I just felt worse. The next week, I was invited to something pretty interesting at work. I generally have a good amount of visibility into what Melanie, boss lady, does on a daily basis. The only element that remained elusive was her bi-weekly check-in with a particularly sharp-dressed, agent-looking fella. There was a pretty consistent presence of state troopers, agents, and similarly uniformed men and women dropping into the diner, though I seldom paid it mind beyond simply noticing it. Midway through wiping down the tables, only an hour or so into my shift, Mel swung by and said, "Hey, want you in the meeting with the big boss, if you have a few." The big boss. Sure. Yeah, coming. Just, if you don't mind me asking, who is it she let her eyes speak her unwritten rules to me? Questions equals generally bad. Thank you for the reminder, ma'am. We maneuvered to a back room and sat at a table. Across from us, already seated, was a man in a sharply tailored suit with a subtle earpiece in the aforementioned agent. The table was littered with a small, messy stack of notes, papers, and documents. He made it a point to size me up, staring me down uninterrupted, like a deer to headlights, no concern at all about how awkward he was making it for me. Then he turned to Melanie. "How long she been here?" he asked her in his gruff Western drawl. "6 months, she said. You trust her?" "I trust her, yes." He let his eyebrows say, "If you say so," then went on with it. "All right, so apparently you had a visit from the wandering man last week. You," he said, motioning to Melanie, "were out. But you," attention now shifted to me, "weren't. Give me the lowdown." The wandering man. The agent caught the confusion in my eyes. "Jesus, you've told this girl nothing, haven't you?" he said to Melanie. "Sir, I know it sounds weird," she said, "but I personally feel as if the man is almost, I don't know, drawn to curiosity. Like, maybe the less I say to those not already in the know, the bet—" "Wandering man," the agent cut her off, "is our nickname for the fella that sits in the corner of your fine little establishment. Or should I say, the state's fine little establishment." "I'm sorry?" I asked. "That's correct. The state's." "Congratulations, ma'am. You're part of a government operation. The wandering man. Not just a cutesy little nickname, but our legal definition of this tricky little problem is a phenomenon we discovered many years ago. At the time, he'd just walked the desert landscape, chatting up unsuspecting strangers with bizarre questions. Everything fine, all hunky-dory. A little weird, sure, but nothing illegal. However, sometimes things would happen because of him. Bizarre things, grisly things." I could see Melanie groaning, concerned at the picture being painted. Would this pique my curiosity? Have you guys, taken him in for... I almost wanted to cut off my own stupid question, but he ran with it. Nope, not because we don't want to, but rather because it might not be safe. The cozy mental image I'd held of this diner was starting to fracture. We have reason to believe that he's a visitor, he said. I didn't attend another debrief after that, not because I was barred, mind you. Rather, I just didn't want to know anymore. My gut no longer held curiosity. There was just a low, aching dread there now. The agents and troopers spaced out and seated amongst the eatery were now just a glaring reminder of what my dingy diner job really was. The government cavalry would mostly show up around the end-of-month window the wandering man was set to arrive in. When he'd appear, they wouldn't do much more than examine him from their distant tables, subtly scribbling notes into notebooks. He'd always act the same. He would just sit there. He wouldn't give them, or us, the diner employees, much to go on. Speaking of employees, I remembered something Melanie told me after my first month of working here, that the worker turnover at this diner was incredibly high. Knowing at the time what everyone got paid, it made absolutely no sense to me. Now, 7 months into the gig, alongside a completely new set of cooks, waiters, and waitresses from when I'd first started, I'd seen firsthand just how true her statement was. None of the leavers claimed as much, but I'm sure the underlying premise of who the diner was really for became subconsciously clear to them during their time here, and it probably didn't sit all too well with them. I stayed, but not because of the pay. I'm actually not sure why I did. We had a new cast of rookie employees now, the ones who understood the vague terms of the situation, just as Melanie, I, and all former employees did, stuck around. Those who couldn't reconcile the situation with their inherent curiosity naturally filtered out. And then there was Malcolm. It was only his first week. He was a keener, mega keener. He'd bulldozed through a giant list of tasks and was already asking for the next batch of work to chew through. Anything he could get ahead of, anything he could step in for, anything he could learn, he was on it. He wanted to be as helpful as humanly possible. I think the salary of the role, for a guy his young age, was just too alluring for him. For our part, Melanie and I tried our best to get him to pace himself. We were both giving the spiel now. By this point, we'd more or less perfected it. There are things about this diner that are strange, rules you will have to follow and not think about. Rules that are concrete, immutable, and non-negotiable, like gravity. He nodded. At that moment, I really believed he was internalizing my words. And if that doesn't work for you, and if you don't think you can take care of yourself, then you shouldn't work here, I continued. There was always a visceral feeling in my stomach whenever I saw the wandering man in the corner during the same week that we were onboarding new staff. I'm sure Melanie felt it too. On those days, Mel and I would both work the till, and if we saw anyone coming out from the back, we'd stop them with a simple grab of the arm. Malcolm stepped out, and I did just that, a rough grasp of his forearm, just like Melanie had done to me when I'd first started. He recoiled in surprise. "Remember that little chat about rules we just had?" I said. He nodded meekly, as if he was already in trouble. I pointed to the man seated at the far table in the brown corduroy shirt, staring straight ahead, with what I believed at the time, no real reason to be here. And I said, "You will not, under any conditions, serve that man. Don't go up to him. Don't talk to him. Pretend he doesn't exist." Malcolm lifted the garbage bag he was holding in his left hand. In my nervousness, I hadn't actually clocked what he was stepping out for. "Just doing garbage duty, ma'am," he said. "But, understood." And then he left out the front door with his usual swagger. The dumpster wasn't as close as we would have liked, so I appreciated his willingness to take on this duty so soon into his employment. I turned back to observe the wandering man. We had a crowd of agents in attendance that day, scattered about the restaurant. The man wasn't one to speak up often. Today was an interesting exception. "Officers," he said, "if you have any questions, feel free to join me at the table to ask them." The agents around the room reacted mainly with snickers. "Seriously, if you come sit with me, I'll be happy to spill it all. Truly." Even more laughs, but no one bit. And yet he continued, pointedly, "I know you're curious. I know you take notes. I know you talk about me. I know you built this establishment for me. I know you—" As I reconciled the fact that this was the most words I'd ever heard him string together in succession, I heard the chime of the bell. A door had opened. Malcolm was dusting his hands as he entered through the diner's side door. A door which was situated right beside the table the wandering man was seated at. It all happened so fast, and yet it played out in front of me excruciatingly slowly, as if there was a moment, a single solitary second, where I could have stepped in. The wandering man dropped any pretext of an exchange with the agents, stopping his sentence midway and adopting a completely new demeanor. He played the role of a low, miserable, tired man and said, "30 visits, terrible service every time," in a pathetic tone just as Malcolm walked by. Malcolm instinctively plucked a notepad out from his chest pocket and turned his head to face the man. "Hey, I got you, Chief. I can have him ring something up for you. What are you—" And then Malcolm froze in place, and the wandering man's expression turned Cheshire Cat wide. His neck alternated between tensing and fluttering, with what seemed to be undeniable excitement. The man started getting up from the table, and then, immediately, both of them were gone. Malcolm and the Wanderer had vanished out of existence entirely. The insanity of the moment was interrupted by the coded language I heard blared over a megaphone. Nonsensical agent speak that has been seared into my memory forever. Alert level black. Wandering target has compromised a civilian. I repeat, civilian has been compromised. And that was that. Melanie quit in the days after. She wasn't mad at me. She told me she always knew she'd leave after the 10th disappearance. Why that specific milestone was required, I have no clue. All I could do from that point was continue to work. On my commutes home or during lunch breaks, I would look up at the stars and put out the wish that Malcolm be brought back home, back from wherever he'd been taken. The debrief with the agents brought me no solace. The exchange with them was simple and short. Where was he taken to? Answered with, "He's gone now." With a perpetual dagger in my soul now, I had only the smallest of silver linings, if you can even call it that. A lesson. The lesson that I needed to be even more watchful, even more diligent. And on days when the wandering man was visiting, the only server at the diner. No exceptions. I knew the agents weren't happy about that. None of them said it to me explicitly, but I could tell that they would learn something new about him every time he whisked someone away after a mistake was made. It was a weird, Darwinian setup they had created. We were a zoo they could use to learn more about a specific animal, a specific entity, a specific visitor. No dice. They'd just have to watch him sit now, or wait for him to do something different. I waited for the 3-day stretch at the end of the month that he usually appears in. Things were quiet up until that point. When he finally showed up, it wasn't what I expected. For the first time ever, I saw the wandering man walk right through the front door, in the dead of night, at the tail end of my shift. I was at the till, paralyzed, as he took step after step to close the distance. And then, he was right there, standing in front of me. And I was sure, absolutely sure, that I was going to die. He smiled. "Don't worry, I have my own little set of rules I play by," he said. I didn't say a word. This was no man's land right now. "I know you've been curious about me. I've admired it from the moment you first spoke up to address me. Cautious curiosity is a great thing to see in someone, especially in such a reckless species. Please, please, just go. I'd like to answer a question about why I'm visiting. I'm sure you'd like to know why I'm here, right? I'm not curious anymore. I swear I'm not. He laughed. The answer is really painfully simple. This little game, this little charade I'm playing, it is just so unbelievably fun. Please don't kill me. Please. You truly have a wonderful planet. I will return again soon. Promise. Give me a month, maybe 2 this time. A sincere, kind smile delivered with kind eyes. I'll come back with a new game. And then he was gone. It took me a minute to realize that there was a cake box sitting on the counter beside me. Maybe it was there the whole time he was speaking to me. Maybe it materialized right after he left. I opened the box to find Malcolm's severed head, a blank expression on his face, sitting on a bed of poorly and confusingly organized flowers. Almost as if there was an intention to create a floral arrangement, but no understanding of what something like that would look like. On top of the horrific display, written in an almost childlike handwriting, was a note that read, "I brought him back, just like you wished." The worst thing about being trapped at a diner in the middle of nowhere is that you realize that there really is nowhere else to run to. Every single part of our planet is blanketed by stars, by open sky. Someone could drop in any time.